just as the baby is coming out, she is privy to something that no one else sees. And she says, everybody, get back, get back, get back. Because erupting, it's the only word I can use, I'm afraid, erupting out of between the Queen's legs is a baby, but it's no ordinary baby. It is a baby girl on the back of a goat, waving a spoon, saying, mate, 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 charging around the room. So everyone is frozen. No one saw this in the runes, as they say. Hello there, welcome to Jawbone. It is cold on the moor today. I'm in one of my innumerable sweaters. I'm drinking coffee. And I'm going to open up a fairy tale, one of my very favourites. It is called Tatterhood. Every teller has a few stories that people always want to hear from them. But as I say, I am afraid I am no jukebox. I go where the breeze takes me, but I'm happy to tell this story today. Now, I must be honest, telling a story in a library in this setting is intimate, but it doesn't quite have the voltage of stepping up in front of, a few hundred people, pushing that energy into the room. But we will do our best. I'll tell the first half. I may have a few thoughts about it. I don't know what they'll be yet. And then we will have another episode for the second part. Some weird kind of thumbs up has just come on the screen. God knows what that is. So the way we begin a story, do you remember I say, shall we go? You say, let's go. We do it 3 times to alert the story. We are vying for its attention. Shall we go? Let's go. Shall we go? Let's go. Shall we go? Let's go. Oh yeah, this is a drum, by the way. We'll talk about the drum at some point. And that's a ring that I'm playing it with on the side. Like the hooves of a horse. So there is a kingdom, both inside and outside you, isn't there? In this kingdom, there is the blue tent of the sky, and under the blue tent of the sky there are green pines, and underneath those green pines there are meadows filled with wild flowers erupting from the earth like cups of honey. I have heard it said, and said myself. And in the middle of that place there is a king and there is a queen, and these people are no Herods. They are loved by their people. Everybody's met them. Everybody has been blessed by them. As the old poets say, wherever they placed their hand, the well water was sweet for 50 miles. They are good. But at night, when they went to bed, when they went back to their chamber, there was a grief that lived between them. And the grief was this: even though they distributed blessings to everybody else, the one thing they really longed for, a child, they could not have. They'd tried everything. Well, being a deep secret, of course, everybody knows about it. You know what communities are like. And in the end, somebody came to them and said, look, you may not be able to have a child yourself, but you have this niece. Why doesn't she come and live in the castle with you? So at the very least, you have the happy chatter of a kid moving up and down the corridors. And so they thought, why didn't we think of this quicker? And that is what happened. The girl moved in with them. And I'm pleased to say it was a happy time. She was adorable. And she had one of those kind of access all area passes to the castle. There was nowhere she could not go. She liked to be up with the minstrels in the gallery. She liked to go down and see what was being cooked in the kitchen. She liked to boogie on the dance floor when they were having their big balls. But the thing she loved most of all was actually to be out at the edge of the garden. They had these very beautiful trimmed gardens. But at the edge of them, of course, is the big, deep forest, the place of the oak trees and the sudden fogs and mists and general mystique. she liked to go down to the edge of the garden with her golden ball and play with it. And one afternoon, the king and queen have finished with their appointments for the day, and they're sitting on their thrones together, and they're still ruminating on the fact that in the midst of all their blessings, they themselves are not fertile. Something is not growing between them. So that's going on in their heads. But down at the very edge of the garden, the girl plays with the golden ball, and it comes to that sacred time in all fairy tales. It comes to dusk, the time we always call down here in Devon the Dimpsey time, the time between dog and wolf. And suddenly, from out of the tree line comes another little girl. Now, this little girl does not look like a princess. She does not look like she's related to royalty. She has an ability, for sure, but it's an ability of the forest. She is this robust little character, wild, no shoes, little jutting chin, sure in herself, though settled in herself. And she says to the princess, she says, I want to play with you in your ball. Throw the ball to me. Throw me your golden ball. Well, this is a big moment in a young girl's life, isn't it? But she ruminates, she cogitates, but she doesn't overthink it too much, because she just chucks the ball to the girl of the wild forest. And the girl holds the ball and she brings it close to her body, then she throws it back. Isn't that lovely? The two girls, the wild girl and the girl of the garden, throw the ball back and forth. This is a shorthand in fairy tales for called weaving your life to the other world, or threading your life to the other world, perhaps. So suddenly this thing is being shared between the forest and the castle. Well, she comes rushing in, the little girl, to see the king and the queen, and she says, Hey, I've been out in the garden with my golden ball at the very edge of the deep forest, and I met this girl from the forest, and she knows about your situation, and her grandmother has knowledge that could help on the issue of fertility. She is one of those hedgerow wild people. And they said, well, for goodness sake, bring her in. We thought we'd met and consulted with everybody. But no, they hadn't. So she is brought in. And first of all, I think if you have any real wisdom in a fairy tale, the thing that these old ones tend to do is they deny that they have any. The 3 Ds, deny, deny, deny. But denial is not just a river in Egypt, because really it's a form of etiquette. That is what is going on. And so when the old woman turns to leave, the young girl, who knows her granny very well, says, look, offer her something, implore her to stay, fall to your knees, do what it takes. And so with a combination of cigars and whiskey and a fiddle player called Seamus up in the gallery sweetening the mood, she stays, and she reveals her hand that she does actually have some knowledge for them. And this is what she says. She points out of the window with her long pale finger at a very high tower. And she says, would I be right in thinking that your bedroom, the king and the queen, your bedroom is very high off the ground? It's the top of that tower. And they said, yep, that's where we've been trying to conceive for years. Oh, says the old lady, this will be easier to fix than I expected. Your eggs have just grown dizzy in your body. That high off the ground, you're not earthed, you're not grounded, and your husband, he's in a similar predicament downstairs. So the two of you have to change where you try and have babies. That's the most benign way, the blandest way I can put it, bearing in mind there may be younger ears in the room. So, Queenie, this is what you're to do. Tonight you're to have a bath, you're to have a long bath, you're to have a soak, have a glass of wine, put herbs in the bath, stay in the bath till your fingers are pruny. Remember those kind of baths when you were a kid? Just staring at what was happening to your own fingers. And then get the servants, this is when it all gets very alchemical, get the servants to gather up your bath water, bring it down, don't get rid of it. It has merit, it has weight, it has essence of you in it. Get your servants to carry it in buckets down through the castle to the furthest hut on your settlement, and then pour it into the soil, because a hut like that just has a soil floor. It doesn't have wood across it or anything. Then drag a bed out, and you and your husband are actually to spend the night commingling at the well of the proverbial dream in that hut. In the morning, when you pull the bed away, you will find that there has been a exfoliation from the ground itself due to the result of your commingling. There will be a red flower and there will be a white flower. If you actually eat the white flower, you will have a child and all will be well. Okay, so that's a lot of information, isn't it? You have a bath, you don't get rid of the water, but you don't spend the night with your husband at the top of the tower. You go down, you take your water, somehow that matters, and it's poured into the ground, and then you spend the night with your husband, and in the morning there's a red and there's a white flower. And the queen says to the old woman, well, what about the red flower? You haven't mentioned the red flower. There's got to be a reason for the red flower. And she says, oh, the red flower, there is... That is nothing for you to worry about. Just stick to the white. All will be well. Your chakras will be balanced. Everybody will be happy. That's the child you want. And with that, the old woman canters out on the dark horse of her pride. I have to take a second because I haven't told you about the old woman's voice. I always say this in stories. They say her voice was odd, that it gurgled and creaked. It was like words gathered from underneath a rock at the very bottom of the river. But there are other storytellers will say, no, it is like rooster blood collected from the heart of the moon. What does that sound like? Rooster blood collected from the heart of the moon. That is for you to speculate. But anyway, some archaic old figure has just wandered into our story, given us some Gnostic information, and now disappeared back off into the forest. So they did what she said, and in the morning there was a red and there was a white flower. And she remembered the instructions. We all remember the instructions. It was clear as a whistle. So why did she do it? As she reached for the white flower, her hand sort of moved, had an agency all of its own, and grabbed the red flower, and she gobbled it all up. I'm not quite sure why we do this. There are religious instructions that say that when we go to heaven, or when we petition to get into heaven, our own body will testify against us. It is said that our hands will say, I went places I shouldn't have gone. And your hips will say, me too. So there she is. And her husband is just sort of standing there in his pajamas watching his wife gobbling the red flower. And then she says, I don't think I was meant to eat this flower. And he says, no, you weren't meant to eat the flower. So he says, listen, what happens in the hut at the edge of the garden stays at the hut at the edge of the garden. No one needs to know about this. We'll go on a Vipassana retreat. We'll figure it out. Why don't you eat the white flower and all will be well. So she eats the white flower, and sure enough, she quickly realizes there is a spark of light growing in the lonely croft of her hips. She is in fact pregnant. 9 months pass, 9 months pass, 9 months pass, and she gives birth. And there is a doula, there is a midwife at the very end, the business end of where the baby is being born. And just as the baby is coming out, the doula sees something. She is privy to something that no one else sees. And she says, everybody, get back, get back, get back. Because erupting, it's the only word I can use, I'm afraid, erupting out of between the queen's legs is a baby, but it's no ordinary baby. It is a baby girl on the back of a goat waving a spoon saying, mate, 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 charging around the room. So everyone is frozen. No one saw this in the runes, as they say. And this little child who has a tattered hood over half her face, she also has the gift of language. She has a facility of language immediately. And she says, hey, everybody, be cool. Be cool. I know I am an unexpected development in this narrative, but just get me something to eat. I'll sit in the corner, get me some hay to lie in, and the baby that you want is about to be born, my sister. Well, a couple of minutes later, this gorgeous little girl is born, and she's lovely, and she has, all her fingers and her toes and the rest of it, and it's very sweet. But it's fair to say the attention in the room, it's not going to be with her, is it? It's going to be with, old little Miss Born to be Wild in the corner. Because this girl, she's still got her spoon. She's on a goat, very sort of self-contained. She's arrived fully realised, enlightened little being in the corner. And this is when the story takes on a very, very beautiful turn. Because unlike a lot of stories that I could tell you, this is not a moment where her mum and dad tried to separate her from the daughter or say she shouldn't belong in the castle or generally ostracised this truly wild presence, this rather shameless presence that we shall call Tatterhood. They didn't. They accommodated within the remit of their lives this rambunctious, spontaneous, gleeful little kid. And so the two girls grow up together. And I would suspect that the parents had different expectations. I wouldn't say ambitions, but different expectations about how life may go for the two of them. But they were not separated. That is the point. They lived in close proximity to each other. And everybody recognized that with the arrival of Tatterhood, storytelling as we know it and enjoy it had arrived in the castle, and this was a kingdom where storytelling was it was a holy commodity. It was a revered thing. Now we knew what it was. How could we have ever lived without Christmas cake or cigars or whiskey, when you develop something that you really love. So back to the tale. It is Christmas Eve, funnily enough. That was the Christmas cake. I was obviously seeing it in my mind. It was Christmas Eve, and the two girls are at that rocky road that separates adolescence from young womanhood. And the fair sister, we'll call her, is being prepared for marriage with somebody. So downstairs, there's going to be a ball, and the courtiers, guys are coming in from the local settlements and castles to audition for the possibility that they may become her husband. But this all feels a bit premature to the young girl and doesn't feel really ready for it. And even her father is suffering a bit, sharpening his sword in case anybody acts up. But it is the protocol of the day to get her married earlier. And it's less to do with romantic love. It's all to do with, political expedience, really, and land management locally. Well, with Tatterhood around, things are never going to go the way you expect it. Because there comes a kind of roaring, rumbling, strange set of noises from around the castle. And the king looks out and he sees that the castle is surrounded by some very wild-looking figures. It's like, 3 chapters of Hell's Angels have turned up or something. And you look out the window and there's all these mythological figures. There's ogres and dryads and naiads and spectres of the night and screech owls swooping about, and everybody's looking distinctly unkempt. The Shaggy Brigade have turned up en masse, and they've got clubs and they've got baleful bulging eyes in the middle of their forehead. Some of them have got 9 udders that is a lactating deadly nightshade. They are what's the word? So an old word in myth. They are an unseelie court. You have the seelie court of the fairy, then you have the unseelie. So this is a strange old bunch, but they always turn up in a teenager's life at some point. Trouble is going to turn up. Now, Tatterhood looks out of the window and she gazes down. She kind of knows a few of them, and they're sort of, generally waves. And she says, I know this lot. She says, I'll go down with my spoon and I will separate them out. And so she goes down, and but before she does it, she brings her sister to the window. She says, "You need to see this. You need to see this." And she says, when a girl is in trouble like this, you need to have big language at your disposal. You need to have poetic leaps, on the tongue. Barley needs to grow from your tongue. So Tatterhood put her spoon up, and she said something like this, as the bards relate. "If my life be short, let my fame be great. Let herds of bears surround me. I will put my hand in the mouth of Fenris the wolf, and I shall not count the cost. I suck on the breast of life. I suck on the breast of life, and I will be a hard butcher for anyone that tries to take me from it." Did you get that, my sister? And her sister says, "You have just officially blown my mind." And Tatterhood charges, doesn't she? She charges into the great mosh pit of the unseelie mob. She flails her spoon, ornamentally at least, left and right. And very quickly people part. Very quickly they turn tail and they run. This one little girl on the back of a goat carries a kind of undeniable truth to her that separates everything in her path. Well, the last of the wild old women leaving looks up at the window, and she sees the fair maiden leaning out with her head. And you know what she does? She reaches up, she grabs the head, she pulls it off, she puts it in a bag, she produces out of the bag the head of a young calf, she screws that onto the head of the fair sister, and she's gone. She's gone. They're all gone. Now, I must remind you at this point, this is actually a fairy tale. This is not just a stream of consciousness coming from me. Although, So, what has just happened? All of these folks turned up. They caused all of this commotion. And the young girl has now got the head of an animal, the head of a calf, not the head that she had 5 minutes ago. And she's there bleating away and making these kind of bleaty calf noises. And her parents are freaking out. And Tatterhood is there with her spoon come in from the battle. And Tatterhood says something like this. She says, well, she's safer like that with the head of the calf than what you were about to do to her. It's too early for her to be thrown into courtship. It is too early for her to be thrown into the pressure cooker of an early marriage. The girl needs more to her life. She needs to understand that at the wedding of every young woman, she should have a dress with 10,000 secrets sewn into it, that all the aunties and the grandmothers sewed it in over time lovingly. A few from her own mother are in there. You don't go unprepared and naive into a marriage. And, says Tatterhood, and I'm beginning to get a feeling she may have choreographed this at this point, she says, I would happen to know where they have gone. Across one field and then another field there is a longhouse, and in the longhouse all the wild old women live. The rambunctious ones, the strange ones, the swirly ones, the opinionated ones, the weeping ones, the funny ones, the powerful ones, they're all over there. And I have a prophetic insight that there is a nail in the wall of the longhouse of the wild women, and they have put her head on that nail with her hair hanging down, and underneath her head, they sit there and they smoke cigars and they gamble and they weep and they tell stories and they do a little bits of stitch and bitch, little bit of knitting, and they generally unearth the salt and the grease and the joy of life together as women. You would be lucky to be in a place like that, and it may be important that my sister is in a place like that for some time, but, well, her head is at least. I said, me and Calf Girl here, why don't we borrow one of your boats, Dad? Don't take the warriors. There's nothing, this is a metaphysical issue. This is nothing that you and your men aren't going to be able to fix this. This is a journey. This is an adventure for me and my sister. And so the two girls headed out over the first field, and then the second fiord, and then up ahead, sure enough, was the longhouse. And you know you've reached the longhouse of the wild old women when you hear this sound. That's the primordial bardic keening of the old lady's longhouse. And Tatterhood said, this must be the place. And that is where we will leave the story for now. So let's just take a minute. We will come back in the next episode and we'll pick the story up. But so much is happening, so much is going on. Sometimes it's important in a story just to take a second. It's unusual for me. I don't think I've ever told a story like that, in a domestic setting like this. I'm usually, as I said, pushing energy into a room, often unamplified. So there's a kind of energy that comes in that is sadly lacking from the strange wanderings that I've just gone on. One of the things that I've been doing in the last 15 minutes that I wouldn't do live is giving you something of a running commentary on what's happening underneath the surface. By and large, with storytelling, the rule is show, don't tell. Show, don't tell. But because this is a slightly different environment, I'm experimenting with the form and I'm getting us to glimpse behind the curtain as we go. So I don't want to tell the story what it is. You know I don't like that. But I will say a few things that are occurring to me now. First thing is this. Fairy tales will alert you almost immediately to what the problem is. And the problem in our story is that we have something that is generative but has run dry at the center. So we have a kingdom or a queendom where they can bless other people, but they themselves have slowly become infertile in some fashion. And I wouldn't overly literalize it into, the business of having children. Something in you is no longer generative. Many of us do that. Many of us in the caring professions end up in this irony of irony. We give to everybody else, but something is no longer generative within us, for us. So that's the first thing that I was thinking about. As you know, I say many times, the end of a story is rarely the point of the story. Knowing a story, stretched on the rack of a story, turning everything into an allegory is rarely the point of a story. The point into the mystery of a story is the image that you keep getting drawn back to, or images. There can be more than one. So the image for me today is the image of the girl with the golden ball. Now, this is something you get in a lot of fairy tales in Europe and Scandinavia. You get young boys with golden balls. You get young girls with golden balls. Many of you will know there's a very famous fairy tale called Iron Hans or Iron John, where a young boy's ball rolls into the cage of an iron cage of a kind of hairy man who's been found in the forest. And when the boy asks for the ball back, he says, well, I'll give you the ball, but for the ball to be given back to you, you have to set me free. And that becomes the great initiatory journey of that young man. Well, it feels like there's a mirror of that happening in this story when the young girl, who's only really in the story for a fraction of a second, she's not quite a princess, but the niece comes down. But what she does is so important, because we come to a fundamental truth of the mythic imagination now. When the center is in crisis, the genius lives on the margins. The information we require always comes from the edge of things. The center can't fix itself. It's why the knights are always leaving Camelot and heading off in all of these different directions. So we encounter, we throw the ball, we take the risk, we are vulnerable, we give something that is precious. It's a story filled with twins and siblings and mirrors. And I love the idea of the hinge. I love the fact that this happens not quite in the forest and not quite in the garden. In myth, a beach is a liminal place, because a beach is neither quite the land and it's neither quite the sea. The tree line is a liminal place because it's not quite the garden and it's not quite the deep forest. Storytellers, as I've said before, always exist on the hinge of things. They live in the tension of the opposites, as the psychologists would say. They live in the crossroads place. A storyteller is somebody that can speak from both sides of their mouth. And you'll have to figure out what that means. To speak from both sides of your mouth, that is the Hermean position, that is the storytelling position, and that is where we find ourselves now. You're not choosing the forest over the garden, you are living in the creative tension of both. And creative tension, as Keats calls it, negative capability, is part of the process of growing into a human being, as I have no doubt said before. So I guess the thought that I would have is, did I ever really throw my golden ball to a wild boy or a wild girl? Am I a platitudinal figure, or do I have a real bit of wild energy underneath my fingernails, as it were? The arrival of the old woman who understands the business of fertility is genius. That the king and the queen are too lofty, that they need to be grounded, they need to be closer to the dirt, literally. They need to be closer to passion, they need to be closer to the things of this world, not in this highfalutin state. That is with me today. And then, of course, whatever you do, don't eat the red flower. We know in fairy tales and stories like this, whenever a character says, whatever you do, don't do that, what do you think is going to happen? Oh, says Bluebeard, I'm just going out. Just don't open that door. See you, Nora. Well, of course, we're going to peer behind the door. And if we didn't peer behind the door, there would be no story. If she didn't eat the red flower, there would be no story. What is the red flower? What is the white flower? The colours, and this is not for today, the colours red, white and black are very significant in fairy tales. They are the really significant colours, and they are enormous in their symbolism and metaphorical and initiatory depth. But you notice that there's a red flower and there's a white flower, but I always feel there's don't abandon the third colour, don't abandon the black, because the black is, of course, what the other colours grow out of. It is the black of the soil, often connected to grief, just as red is connected to passion and white is connected to, well, what is white connected to? The associations are endless, but is often connected to a kind of refined spiritual state, shall we say. So all of these things are swirling around us. If an image is not grabbing you, then it is not the right moment to be investigating it. If something is troubling you, if there is something that a fairy tale is not mentioning, which happens all the time, because the fairy tale tradition is not like a modern novel. It doesn't give you what they call characterization. You very rarely know much about the inner lives of the figures. You know about their outer life, and what's going on inside is mirrored, for example, by all the strange characters turning up at adolescence. You know, I've said this before, as I've said most of this, but it bears repeating. It is every parent's experience that one day you're going to look at your child and see nothing but a wild animal. And that can happen when they're very small, but it can also happen at adolescence. It can also happen when their wingspan is starting to smash into the house, especially with young guys. And it is really time for them to be lifted out of that environment into something where actually they have less surety, they have less confidence, a la a wilderness vigil. It settles them to be by a fire in an unusual and uncanny environment. So what is going on there? Well, when I first realised I had to tell Tatterhood, the image or the moment that would not leave me alone is actually the encounter with the calf, the head of the calf, because that was when I realised, as is often the case with a fairy tale, that standing behind the fairy tale is a far more ancient myth. And the notion that a young woman at adolescence for a while carries the head of an animal, not a girl, that is ancient material. That is profound. And it reminds me of the kind of processes that would have gone on in the Mediterranean thousands of years ago, when a young girl could enter the Temple of Artemis, for example, and for a few years, she's not to marry. She's not to be sort of put on the market in that way, but she learns certain dances, certain kind of bear rituals, certain libations to Artemis. She learns to taunt boys, but not necessarily to make love with them just yet. And again, she understands, most importantly now, the mythic ground she stands upon. The mythic ground she stands upon. I was beginning to give quite a lot of spillage of this into the actual story, forgive me, when I was saying there is a dress of 10,000 secrets. Now that actually comes from another story, a Russian fairy tale. When you tell stories like I do, this is part of the folk tradition as well. Something happens called vagrant stanzas, where stories actually start to speak to each other in your bag of imagining, your crane skin bag that you as a Shanachie carry with you. So that was a bit of a vagrant stanza, which made my point though, the mythic ground you stand upon, not generally what culture at large mirrors back to you these days. So we know this is an initiation story. We know that the two girls are now off on this extraordinary adventure together to see if they can find the head of the fair daughter. And in our next episode, we shall go back into the story and we will find out quite what has happened.